Thank you for joining today's hybrid seminar organized by NUS Libraries, NUS Department of History, and the Wan Bu Sao Research Center for Chinese Culture under the NUS Department of Chinese Studies. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the NUS Department of Chinese Studies and the Wan Bu Sao Chinese Library in 1953. Today's seminar commemorates this significant milestone. Starting out as the Chinese Library at the then University of Malaya, the Wan Bu Sao Chinese Library has come a long way. Its collection has grown by leaps and bounds with the support of NUS and generous contributions from donors, enabling the Chinese Library to strengthen its collection. With over 620,000 volumes of Chinese library books, 54 databases, 130,000 electronic books, and 47,000 electronic journals. The Chinese Library is considered among the top 10 academic libraries on Chinese studies outside of the mainland and its special administrative regions. It was renamed the Wan Bu Sao Chinese Library in December 2021 in recognition of the continuing support of the Wan family since 1995. Today, the topic of our seminar is New Work in Chinese Buddhism Studies. This panel highlights exciting new work in Chinese Buddhist studies by 4 current and recently graduated students at NUS. Each panelist will also discuss NUS Libraries resources that they have used for their research. Today's moderator is Dr. Jack Chia. He is Assistant Professor of History and Religious Studies at the NUS Department of History. He is a historian of religion whose research focuses on Buddhism and Chinese popular religion. He is the author of Monks in Motion, Buddhism and Modernity Across the South China Sea, which was awarded the 2021 Eurosys Humanities Book Prize and shortlisted for the 2023 Friedrich Wöhler Prize. Dr. Chia is currently working on 2 book projects: Sister in Dharma, a Buddhist feminist in post-colonial Indonesia, and Diplomatic Dharma, Buddhist diplomacy in modern Asia, which is supported by the 2020 Social Science and Humanities Research Fellowship awarded by the Social Science Research Council Singapore. In 2022, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Dr. Chia, please, I will hand the session over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Chai-Kim, for the really kind and generous introduction. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, a very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you, Chai-Kim, and the wonderful team at the NUS Libraries for the effort in putting together today's event. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome all of you to the panel on New Work in Chinese Buddhist Studies that celebrates the joint 70th anniversary of the NUS Department of Chinese Studies and Wan Bu Sao Chinese Library. This remarkable milestone is a testament to the dedication and passion of generations of scholars, educators, and librarians who have contributed to the growth and development of Chinese studies, making NUS one of the very best centers for Asian studies in the region, if not the world. May I take this opportunity to congratulate our colleagues in the Department of Chinese Studies and the Wan Bu Sao Chinese Library for their achievements and contributions in promoting the study of Chinese languages and culture. Today's panel highlights NUS growing strength in the field of Chinese religion and Buddhist studies. I'm very excited to introduce the new work in Buddhist studies by our outstanding current and recently graduated students at NUS. Our panelists will cover a wide range of topics, which include Buddhism and politics during the early Tang dynasty, sacralization of Mount Jiuhua in the Anhui Province of China, Chinese Buddhist missions to South and Southeast Asia during the Sino-Japanese War, and Chinese Buddhist art in maritime Southeast Asia. As Chai Kim pointed out, they will also discuss NUS Library resources they've used for their research. Each panelist will be given 18 minutes to present their work, followed by a Q&A session with the audience. Without further ado, I will introduce our first presenter, Bei Yuxuan. Bei Yuxuan is a final year master's student in the Department of History, where he is a recipient of the FASS Scholarship in Buddhist Studies. His research focuses on the relationship between the imperial states and various religious traditions in Middle Period China. He is currently completing a master's thesis studying the political legitimation of imperial prefaces during the Tang dynasty. Yuxuan recently received a full scholarship to pursue his PhD in Chinese Buddhism at UCLA this fall. The floor is yours, Yuxuan.
Yes, PDF. Yep. Oh, yes, is this one? We can share, but change it to the other one. No, the other one. No, the other. Yes. Thank you so much. Okay. Let's check whether does it work or not. Sorry, I need to shift down a little bit taller. Thank you. I hope you're able to hear me out. Is it? Sorry, I think this is not really okay. It's working. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Cha for Dr. Cha and NUS Library for this invitation, so that I'm able to present my talk. My gratitude extend towards my own supervisor, Dr. Wang Jingping, for guiding me throughout this process, and also my gratefulness also extend to FASS Scholarship in Buddhist Studies that actually supported my current research about this Buddhistic political legitimation of imperial preface in early Tang. So this is my what I'm going to share for this entire session. So before I actually go on to talk about my research, I'm just going to outline that. I'm going to tell about 4 different sections. I'll first begin with sort of like a short introduction to everyone, my historical background of who is involved in this entire research, mainly the Emperor Taizong and also the famous Buddhist monk Xuanzang. I'll give some basic definitions, and of course, I'm going to give one specific case example of my research as well. Due to time constraint, I'm unable to present my entire thesis, so this case example will serve as sort of like a condensed form of what I'm trying to express as well. And finally, my last part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about what are the NUS library resources that I actually use during my research. So okay, let us, without further ado, I'll go on to begin my presentation about my research. So you might be wondering, what am I actually talking about? There's this very famous Buddhist monk who actually went to India and brought back a number of Buddhist sutras during the very early Tang dynasty by the name of Xuanzang. So he actually brought back a number of these Buddhist sutras, and he got the permission to translate these sutras into classical Chinese. So this specific monk is named Xuanzang, which eventually inspired the more of like a fan fiction kind of his version known as Tang Zhang in the famous Journey to the West. But that's not the main point of our presentation. I'm going to focus on his historical personality. He actually wrote a letter asking for the reigning Tang emperor to write a preface for his newly translated Buddhist sutra. But he felt extremely frustrated because Taizong actually rejected his request right on the very first try. So he understood the utter importance of actually obtaining imperial approval for this new translation. So 2 years after this initial rejection, he actually wrote another request to the Emperor Taizong to ask him, please help me write a preface. And this time Taizong actually acceded to it and actually wrote a preface. Moreover, he actually asked his crown prince, which is a future emperor Gaozong, to actually write additional 2 addendums to the original preface. So we have 3 different primary sources that we're talking about here. This sudden change of heart is suddenly like acquiescing to his Xuanzang's request to write a preface actually mirrored his policy that actually have about turned due his actually official state policy towards Buddhism. Before Xuanzang actually returned from India, Taizong was sort of a little bit more antagonistic towards Buddhism, but he actually changed his attitude. We might never know his personal intention, but his initial hesitance actually betrayed a sense of deliberating a future political ramifications. So the successful enthusiasm of writing preface actually indicated an attempt to frame this preface as an overt imperial support of Buddhism. So this paper discusses just one specific aspect for such political such influence, which is this political significance, which is known as the political legitimation. Right now, you will be thinking, so what is political legitimation? We'll first talk about political legitimacy. Political legitimacy is actually an idea of like a political entity is the support that's been provided by the root, which is usually the masses, towards the ruling political entity, which is usually the state itself or the emperor. Whereas political legitimation refers to a process of constructing or adhering to a specific legitimation criteria. Once this, let's say the state itself, they adhere to this specific criteria, they will gain the support from the masses or from whichever they want to gain support from. So the usually the constant notion that we know about political legitimation is actually about this concept known as mandate of heaven. You gain the mandate of heaven, then you gain legitimacy, and then you're able to, legitimize your rule over the masses. However, there are also other religious political legitimations that are actually being used to also shore up this legitimacy. For this paper, we are going to focus on the Buddhistic political legitimation. This is sort of a term that I try to cover all these Buddhist aspects of how the state trying to legitimize themselves, using Buddhist aspect to legitimize their own rule. And I specifically define it as a positive interaction towards this Buddhist Ratnatraya ideals, which is also known as Sanbao in Chinese, which is how they adhere to or they support either the idea of Buddha or the Buddhist teachings or the Buddhist monastics. So you might be asking, how am I going to look at this political legitimation? Where can I look from? The sources that I actually use, also known as the imperial preface. So this is an example of an imperial preface that I actually use in my research, as well as it's one of the second oldest manuscript that actually writes about the imperial preface. It's being copied. It's not the actual manuscript that is being written by Taizong himself, but it's being copied during, I think, the 700 plus era. It's currently now been stored in the National Library of France. I've been there, actually took out this entire piece of paper. It's quite brittle. It's named as, the core number is Palois Chinois 3127. So I'm basing my research on most of my research on this original manuscript, if I can able to find it. So you might be thinking, why do I choose this specific genre, this text? This is a piece of writing authored usually by the reigning emperor or the emperor's heir, and then placed in front of the Buddhist canon or specific particular Buddhist sutra. This itself, imperial preface, actually can act as a betwixt and between, because it is neither a thoroughly Buddhist hagiographical source, also it is not purely an imperial document. It functions similarly to like a direct edits being issued by emperor, and is capable of exerting substantial political authority even beyond Tang Dynasty, because afterwards people will rewrite, reprint, and copy out these imperial preface over and over again throughout times. So after clearing up all of these basic interpretation, basic definitions, I'm going to move on to sort of give a few examples about how do I argue. For in this case, in one of the very first source that I'm going to talk about is the preface itself, where Taizong actually wrote about like he tried to portray himself as a key figure to saving the deceased beings through merit making, and he demonstrated a very similar critical role in this in his own imperial preface. This specific quoted section that I'm presenting it right now actually came after a long paragraph that depicts Xuanzang's journey that bring back the Buddhist sutra to Tang, China. A section actually described the efficacy of Buddhist teaching that enable all beings to actually attain Buddhism's sociological goal, which is actually to basically liberate oneself from the never-ending cycle of samsara or lunhui. Xuanzang translated this as me too or mistaken path. So you can notice that there's imagery of burning house extinguished by water is actually one of imagery that symbolizes the process of saving all beings from the sufferings of samsara. Is highlighted, sorry, it's red color in there. And these teachings were actually only available because of Xuanzang's travel that brought back the new Buddhist sutra. However, Xuanzang's celebrated return was only viable under the auspices, which means that they're under the only allowed by the imperial state, and specifically only allowed to be successful because of Taizong's patronage. The preface did not mention this patronage explicitly, but the very existence of the preface itself and the ongoing state-sponsored translation movement demonstrated the implicit involvement of Taizong inside the Xuanzang's career. So you're looking at this and you might be wondering, how does this ever contribute to my argument? Because the next two sources supports the idea that Taizong actually tried to portray himself as a salvation, the person who saved all the beings. Repeats the mess. This is written by Gao Zong. He repeats the exact same message, use the exact same imageries of burning house extinguished by water or Dharma rain in this case. Most importantly, it makes an explicit argument that the reigning emperor was the cause of such imagined integration of geographical location across Indian's continent to Tang, China. Focusing on some of the words here that talks about, like for example, they describe that water from mythical lake of Anavapta flows into the 8 rivers within a Guangzhong Rain, which actually sits the present Tang capital Chang'an, where the Taizong and past Chinese dynasty rulers reigned from. It also describes the Mount Jiuhua, where the Buddha conducted his sermon, also connected with the center of Western Marchmao, which is Mao Song and Mao Hua, Songshan and Huashan. So this quoted section itself is actually, by linking these two geographical locations together, is actually trying to suggest and trying to recast that this effort of Xuanzang's effort, bringing back this Buddhist sutra, is actually Taizong's own contribution. You're linking the imperial locations, holy location of Buddhist local locations with the imperial Chinese locations together, and it is Taizong's contribution that led these sutras to transmit from India to China in the first place. So in other words, Taizong is a primary facilitator. The next paragraph actually shows the exact same thing again. It shows that the supplement again created an image of the reigning emperor of Taizong possessing both qualities of Indian and Chinese legendary monarchs, which ensured the spread of Buddhism in China. So once again, you look at stuff that look at the things that Li Zhi or the Crown Prince actually wrote in here. He wrote that in Taizong was he who turns the wheel. It's actually an abbreviation for the full Indic term known as Chakravartin or wheel turner, which denotes a universal ruler whose wheels of the war chariot was unobstructed. At least in Buddhist idea, that wheel is the Dharma wheel, the wheel that actually spreads Buddhism across the known world. Whereas he on the exact same sentence, he used the same Chinese context and to describe Taizong as recline, cui gong, or originally referred to pre-Qing ancient ruler in the Confucian classics of either a book of documents, Shang Shu, or record rights, Li Ji, who ruled their realm without much intervention. The most important thing is that the supplement neither delineated between these two different monarchs' characteristics, nor made a case that both terms were equal. So these two characteristics were placed side by side in clear juxtaposition. And then the next sentence, it talks about, again, they integrate sacred Indian Buddhist geography with Chinese imperial location. The Narayana River, where the Buddha recuperated from strict asceticism before his enlightenment, flows near the Tang Pond, Changchi, situated within Weiyang Palace, Weiyang Gong of the fallen imperial Western Han Dynasty. The Amarana Garden, where the Buddha taught his teachings, collected in the Vimakrtina Desa Sutra, which also known as Wei Mo Suo Suo Jie Jing, was connected with the Shangling Park, which is also imperial reserve of the late Western Han. Both cases that I just said basically make us really the in-the-face connection between the Buddhist sacred locations in India with past imperial locations in China, which is why this supplement, this specific primary sources itself, some symbolize the transmission of Buddhist teaching from India to China with Taizong as a critical enabling role instead of Xuanzang. All the three sources that I just said before was all telling the same story. They are not saying that Xuanzang is the one who are bringing back the sutra. They're saying that Taizong, the emperor himself, is the one who is enabling these things to happen, allowing them to he himself became the actual savior of all beings. He's not only supporting the Buddhist Dharma, he's not only saying that I am actually allowing Xuanzang to translate this Buddhist sutra, but rather he's saying that I am also the one who ensure all of you, all the beings are savior. It's actually suggesting that he's equivalent to the Buddha, because well, Buddha taught the Buddhist Dharma, the teachings, and they're able to save all the beings. So this kind of ideas where he's a supporter and he himself is a Buddha itself perfectly fits this idea that this is a Buddhistic way of legitimizing himself, using a Buddhistic idea to make him as a Buddhist kingship that will definitely appeal to these Buddhist devotees among his subjects and also therefore garner the specific legitimacy. In case if anyone now is quite lost, I will say that this is just one specific example that I was listed inside my chapter, that is also inside my master thesis, and there are of course real life examples, other examples that could support my argument, but I do not have time to actually fully flesh out all in the footnotes and stuff along that line. So how do I come to this research? What are the resources that I use? First of all, if anyone who is interested in doing Chinese Buddhist studies, I will highly recommend, first of all, to use these two books of like Dictionary of Chinese Buddhist Terms. It's actually compiled by Su Fiu and Holders, both are great Buddhist scholars. And of course, the recent Princeton Dictionary of Buddhism is compiled by Robert Boswell and Donald Lopez. Both of the books itself is actually right now at the back is inside NUS Library collection. And these books are important because you have to use these books when to do translations, translating terms and double checking whether these terms are actually accurate towards at least the Buddhist theological meanings. And of course, because the Chinese Buddhism, because some specific Chinese Buddhism is limited within like used only by the Chinese Buddhist himself. And I base my research mostly on two of, there's one of it, The Offerings of Jade and Silk by Howard J. Welcher is one of the very pioneer work in doing political legitimation in my research field, and also April Hughes' latest research in going into this field is The Worldly Saviors and Imperial Authority in Medieval Chinese Buddhism. And finally, there are specific primary sources that I use, which is only can be found like using NUS library resources such as the Diaolong full text database of Chinese and Japanese ancient books. I use one of the very famous sources known as Tang Da Zhao Ling Ji, or basically means as this entire compilation of Tang Dynasty edicts written by emperor is actually available in text as well back at the collection in NUS library, but you can actually access it through online. And as you've seen here in the PPT. And finally, the last one to recommend everyone is that doing all of this requires a lot of research and search and doing a lot of, I would say, reference between different Buddhist sutras. These sutras are usually collected, what we know as the Chinese Buddhist canon is currently available in the CBETA, the Chinese Buddhist Electronic Text Association website, where you can use keywords to find out related terms and sources, and it will direct you to different specific version of this canon itself. So with that, I think that will be the end of my presentation. I hope that you actually sort of understand what I'm trying to do, a bit, I would say, cryptic and very ancient. And thank you so much for this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yushen, for your fascinating presentation. Now we know the real Xuanzang, right? Right, our second panelist is Dr. Wang Sisi. Wang Sisi is a postdoctoral fellow in Buddhist Studies in the History Department. She received her PhD in Chinese Studies at NUS, where she was a recipient of the FASS Scholarship in Buddhist Studies. Her PhD dissertation focuses on the Jiuhua sacred mountain in late imperial and republican China. Her research interests include Chinese Buddhism, sacred space, pilgrimage, social history, and Sino-Southeast Asian religious networks. Dr. Wang's postdoc research focuses on Buddhist diplomacy and transnational religious networks in modern Asia. The floor is yours, Sisi.
Thank you, Dr. And thank you so much for the very kind introduction. And thanks all for coming. Oh. I'm Wang Sisi. I'm currently, as introduced by Dr. I'm currently a postdoc in the history department and graduated from the Department of Chinese Studies last year. And so I'd like to thank the NUS Library and both departments for enabling this panel discussion. Today, I will share one case studies and combine it with primary and secondary sources I have collected in China and Singapore. The talk I will present is based on my dissertation, which studies the sacralization of Mount Jiuhua by secular forces during the Mingqing dynasty and the Republican China. You can see a map of sacred sites in China, and there are many holy sites identified as Buddhist, Taoism, and Confucian holy sites. And I have marked the mountain Jiuhua in Chizhou, Anhui Province in red. And of course, the sacred space have been a subject of academic inquiry for a very long time. But I wanted to say that recently the studies in this field have emphasized to consider the multi-purpose of a sacred site. That is to see if we wanted to truly understanding a Buddhist holy site, for example, it's better to not to solely focus on its Buddhist dimension. So in my dissertation, I examined how expanding network of monks, local lineages, and inter-regional pilgrims, each with their own agency, contributed to the space production that defined this mountain as a Buddhist holy site. And the case I will present today reveals the strategies employed by the local lineages in transformation a mountain located at their doorstep, then into a national renowned landmark. And this is an aspect that hasn't been largely overlooked by province research. And the NUS Library, with a vast book collection on religious studies and efficient document delivery service that enabled me to obtain secondary sources and set the foundation of my research. And the case I will share today is a Confucian shrine on this Buddhist sacred peak. And you can see a map on the right side of this page. This is a Shenjingquan tool, which gives us an overview of Mountain Jiuhua. And you can find many temples and some Confucian shrines as shown in this smaller screenshot, that indicating that the existence of the multicultural on this mountain. And I wanted to say that in addition to monks, many famous Confucius scholars, including Wang Yangming, visited this place. And Wang Yangming carried out his lecture study practice during the Hongzhi and Zhengde period of the Ming Dynasty. But what caught my attention was a story of little boss Liu Bingyu that I heard during my fieldwork. You know, that locals always shared the stories about the mountain owners with me. Here, the mountain owners refers to the 4 main local lineages known as Ke Wu Liu Luo. Those lineages took turn providing food for pilgrims during the Xiayuan festival in the Republican China. And during these events, the Yangming Shrine on this mountain will serve as their office. So in the 1940s, Mr. Liu Bingyu, a wealthy member of the Liu lineage, was the individual who oversaw these events, and he provides many free rice dumplings for the pilgrims. And it was said that someone would shout slogans like starting with Ke Wu Liu Luo, blah, blah, blah. So the kindness of those lineages was well known among pilgrims. And also this story highlights the existence of an exclusive alliance among mountain owners, because only those 4 lineages had the authority to provide food for this event. And then I want to add that this mountain was not recognized as the seat of Dizang Bodhisattva until the late Ming. And also, only after the late Ming, it became a national pilgrimage center and one of the 4 famous Buddhist mountains in China. So my question is, why and where did those 4 lineages took control of this Yangming Shrine, and did one's activities and its relics contributed to the making of a Buddhist holy site? So based on the temple gazetteers, the history of the Yangming Shrine can be restored. Here I wanted to say a little bit about the temple gazetteer. You know that many temple gazetteers were produced between the 16th and 20th century, and they are currently hosted in worldwide libraries. And on this page, the right side, this is show an online database, a digital archive of Chinese Buddhist temple gazetteers. And this online database offers digital temple gazetteer, and some of them can even be full text searched. And those gazetteers contain detailed account of like mappers, biographies, and miracle stories, and much more. And if you are interested in those temple gazetteer, you can find one paper version on the display over here. Okay, then let's turn back to the Yangming Shrine. And in the 1528, a Yangming Academy was built just 1 year before Wang passed away. And after his pass, one part of this academy was reconstructed and turned into the Yangming Shrine. But the final sacrificial role were completed nearly 100 years after Wang's death, with students of Wang Yangming and the followers of his philosophy. Among those individuals who listed on the sacrificial roles, only those from the 4 families, the 4 lineages owned the corresponding shrines. So this is a very important point. And to understand the activities of those 4 lineages, let's shift from the mountain down to its base. And many lineages had been living here for generations, long before this mountain became a national pilgrimage center. And we can find that there are many variable and well-preserved genealogies, as well as the inscriptions on the mountain and in the region. We can include those materials that contains information not found in the temple gazetteer, especially the details of the donation through generation and the intergeneration relationship between donors. So based on those materials, I found that the 4 lineages were the primary donors and supporters of this mountain, both Buddhist and non-Buddhist affairs. This was one of the main reasons why they were mountain owners. And the Yuanying Shrine offers a non-Buddhist venue and structure for those lineages working together and continuing to engage in the mountain-related matters. To illustrate, let me take the Liu family as an example. The primary donors have been identified and color-coded based on the different period. So firstly, after Yuanying transition, the Liu families were the crucial players in the Buddhist revival of this mountain, surviving as a primary benefactor for the temple reconstruction, as well as recommending and supporting the main temple's abbot. And after that, in the Mid-Ming, the offspring of those individuals carried out the legacy to support the Buddhist development. And then in the late Ming, Wanli period, I have highlighted the 3 men in green. The Liu Zhi and his 2 sons, Liu Guangfu and Guangde, were the leaders in the temple rebuilding project during the Wanli period. And additionally, they were the individual listed on the sacrificial rolls of the Yuanying Shrine. So at that time, I wanted to point out is the situation was much different from the early Ming, because Buddhism in this region had reached its peak, and the monks became more powerful and received donations from countless pilgrims. As a result, they no longer merely depended on the local lineages as they did in the early Ming. So it challenges the local families' authority in Buddhist affairs. So those local families needed new strategies to deal with the new situation, because most people from those families were dependent on this mountain for their livelihood, whether through agriculture, commerce, or other means. So one of the strategies was to cope the non-Buddhist building here, that is the Yuanying Shrine, because all 4 families had ancestors who worshipped here and owned corresponding shrines. So the Liu family, along with other 3 families, were actively responsible for rebuilding the shrines and the corresponding shrines since the late Ming and early Qing. And during the Qianlong period, the 4 families united and took control on it, because at that time, a new Yuanying Shrine was built in the county town. So the ritual function of this shrine, the shrine on the mountain, disappeared. And in the late Qing and the Republic period, it transformed into the gathering place for those families, as illustrated in the story of the little boss Liu Bingyu. So in summary, I wanted to emphasize 3 points. The first point is the integration of sacred sites into secure networks. The people who depended on the mountain, especially holy religious mountains, for their livelihood, I think diverse scholarly attention, and I think they brought out changes to the secret site while they also negotiate with their interests with each other, and as well as the space. And the second point examines multicultural integration in the making of a Buddhist secret site. I want to highlight that the non-Buddhist aspect also needed to be examined in Buddhist study. And the final point is the source of this research. The secondary sources in the NUS Libraries set the foundation for the academic dialogue. The local Chinese sources, such as maps, temple gazetteers, and genealogies, inscriptions, and also some unpublished religious materials, that I obtained from my fieldwork in China and from online database also formed the basis for the dissertation's argument and the analysis. So that's all for my talk. Thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you, Shishi. And after listening to your presentation, now I want to visit Jiuhua-san. Well, our third presenter is Xiangyun. Xiangyun is an honors year student in the Department of History. Since stumbling upon a module on Chinese religion in her second year, she has developed an interest in the role of religion in modern Asia. She recently completed her honors thesis on Chinese Buddhist mission to South and Southeast Asia during the Sino-Japanese War. Xiangyun will begin her master's in history at NUS this fall. The floor is yours, Xiangyun.
Thank you, Prof. Chia, for the introduction. So to start, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Xiangyun, and today I'll be sharing more about my honors thesis project titled Journey to the South, Chinese Buddhist Missions to South and Southeast Asia. So to start, let me share about a newspaper article that first sparked my curiosity about my topic. It appeared in the Xinzhou Ribao and the Union Times on 25th April 1940. To roughly summarize its contents, the anonymous writer behind this article was unhappy that Venerable Taixu, a Chinese monk from China who was in Singapore at the time as part of a wartime Buddhist mission, had tried to raise funds for an international Buddhist college. The writer felt that the wartime situation in China was tense, and that if funds were available, it should go towards areas relevant to the Chinese nation's needs. I was intrigued and began reading up more about the overseas trips undertaken by Chinese Buddhist monks during the Second Sino-Japanese War. I found many mentions of Taixu's overseas Buddhist mission to South and Southeast Asia from 1939 to 1940 in hagiographies and scholarly books and articles. In these accounts, Taixu's mission was often characterized as a successful instance of Buddhist diplomacy. At the same time, I remember feeling puzzled when I hardly read about any instances of unhappiness that might have arisen during Taixu's mission. So how should we understand this article's criticism of his trip? Additionally, I wondered about other Chinese Buddhists who had also traveled to this part of the world during the war. Where did they fit into the picture? My study focuses on two case studies. The first would be Venerable Yuanying's fundraising mission to Singapore and Malaya from 1937 to 1938. The second would be Taixu's earlier mentioned mission to South and Southeast Asia from 1939 to 1940. I argue that these missions were part of a broader picture of Buddhist wartime diplomacy that was supported by the Kuomintang, henceforth KMT. I also suggest that these missions reflected a shift in the KMT's previously hardline stance towards Chinese Buddhism. So looking at scholarship on 20th century Chinese Buddhism, the overseas wartime involvement of Chinese Buddhists has not gone unnoticed. As early as the 1960s, Holmes Welch published works that mention these overseas trips undertaken by Chinese Buddhists during the war. Other important works to be highlighted would be Xue's English and Chinese monographs on Buddhism, war and nationalism. So Xue tells us about how Taixu, as a key communicator between the Chinese Buddhist sector and the KMT, came to lead a wartime delegation with the political goal of invoking Buddhist support of China from Asian countries. As I'll touch on later, Taixu's mission wasn't simply about this political goal, as scholars like Tan Sen have noticed. Taixu also used the mission as an opportunity to promote a global Buddhist movement. Yet, it seems that post-Welch scholarship has pivoted around Taixu. We are then prompted to ask the question, are there further patterns of agencies and agendas to be uncovered if we extend our research scope to look beyond this monk? So by including Yuanying's fundraising trip, I propose that we can review a broader view of war and Buddhism in Republican China. In addition, I think there are two further limitations in current literature. First, studies have often relied on a lean source base. Consequently, certain aspects of their trips that I highlight in my study, such as the KMT's involvement in Yuanying's trip, as well as the criticisms Taixu had received in the region, end up being overlooked. Second, these studies rarely engage with earlier scholarship on religion and Republican China. As a result, little attention has been paid to these overseas Buddhist missions against the bigger context of a changing religious landscape in China at the time. So apart from available Chinese language sources on Chinese Buddhism, like commemorative books, my study mainly relies on English and Chinese language newspaper reports on Yuanying and Taixu's missions that were published in Southeast Asia, sources that have thus far remained underutilized in Buddhist studies scholarship. Now, let's move on to discussing the historical context behind these overseas missions. I think it is important to keep in mind that Chinese Buddhism at the turn of the 20th century was in a precarious position. It was still trying to recover from the devastation of the Taiping Rebellion, dealing with criticisms from Christian missionaries, and grappling with waves of temple confiscations and anti-religion campaigns. Circumstances were made worse in the Nanjing decade under the nationalist regime. As Rebecca Nadelstock has shown in her book Superstitious Regimes, the nationalists had launched a large-scale social engineering project that attempted to separate life into distinct spheres of political, religious, social, and economic activity alongside China's march towards modernity. As a consequence, Chinese Buddhists found themselves even more hard-pressed to prove their religion's relevance to the needs of the state and the nation. It was in response to this crisis that Chinese Buddhist reforms of the early 20th century occurred. Many Chinese Buddhists, including Yuanying and Taixu, spent much time advocating for Chinese Buddhism's place in modern Chinese society. Critically, this crisis also shaped their response to the Sino-Japanese conflict that progressed through the 1930s and eventually culminated in the full outbreak of war in 1937. During the 1930s, Chinese Buddhists faced many wartime anxieties, which formed the backdrop for the overseas missions that I examined. For one, they met with much distress as they failed on multiple occasions to convince their Japanese counterparts of the futility of war. They also encountered dilemmas over the idea of direct military involvement, which conflicted with their commitments to Buddhist principles and precepts. Many Chinese Buddhists who did not want to take up arms engaged in relief efforts in various cities. Contextualized against what I mentioned earlier about the pressures for Chinese Buddhism to prove its relevance to the state and the nation, these initiatives were imbued with much urgency. So commenting on Buddhist relief work, Chinese Buddhists were worried that their religion would be seen as passive and pessimistic compared to more socially engaged religions like Christianity or Islam. Last but not least, they were worried over Japanese Buddhist propaganda claiming the deterioration of Chinese Buddhism. As we shall see, Taixu's mission was in large part motivated by desire to counter this Japanese propaganda. Having laid out the historical context, I'll now share more about Yuanying's mission to Southeast Asia. To briefly introduce him, he was a charismatic and well-respected Chan master who worked hard to protect Chinese Buddhism against the unfriendly policies handed down from government and anti-religious activists. He recognized the need for the reorganization of Chinese Buddhism, although his reforms were relatively more conservative compared to other Chinese Buddhist leaders like Taixu. Important to our discussion would be Yuanying's connection to South China Sea Buddhism, so a term coined by Prof. Jack Chia in his book, to describe the forms of Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia that arose from Buddhist networks across the South China Sea. Prior to the outbreak of war, he had already established links with the communities in Southeast Asia, links that he was able to tap on later during the war to garner support for Buddhist relief efforts back home. So on 15 October 1937, the Ministry of the Interior, Neizhengbu, received a message from Yuanying and other members of the Chinese Buddhist Association, pointing out the lack of funds hindering their efforts, their relief initiatives. Yuanying and his peers asked for approval to travel to Nanyang to fundraise. A week later, the ministry approved the proposal, but requested for more information from the association. It also stipulated that the association had to follow Regulation 16 of its own charter and duly report the amount raised to the ministry and make its fundraising record public. It seems that all went well, and the delegation led by Yuanying set out for Singapore around mid-November 1937. So in the region, he was warmly received by Chinese communities. he was invited to conduct Dharma assemblies and talks at various temples, where he emphasized the need to resist Japanese aggression and to save the nation. He even had the chance to talk at the Singapore Chamber of Commerce, where he proposed the formation of the Singapore Committee for collecting donations for Chinese Buddhist rescue teams. We learned that he managed to gain the backing of prominent overseas Chinese leaders like Tang, Aw Boon Haw, and Aw Boon Pa, who pledged financial and moral support. Importantly, I suggest that local newspaper reports can offer a richer picture of Yuanying's trip. I highlight an angle that, to my knowledge, has yet to be discussed in detail, namely the role of Lin Sen, a notable Buddhist high-ranking KMT official. I found that many reports reported that Yuanying had arrived in Nanyang with handwritten messages from Lin Sen. For example, in his message introducing Yuanying to the Hokkien Association in Ipoh, Tang had informed that Yuanying had come to the region with letters from Lin. It appears that there was an effort from the upper ranks of the KMT to publicly recognize and support the resistance efforts of Chinese Buddhists. On the surface, it hardly seems surprising Lin was a devout Buddhist himself. However, we should recall the hostile outlook that Chinese Buddhists had faced in earlier years. Then, in spite of his own religion, Lin, alongside other Buddhist KMT officials, had not supported Buddhism publicly. In fact, as Rebecca Nettlestone argues, it was only from the beginning of the 1930s, with national crises like Japanese aggression, that KMT officials started to reconsider the benefit of religion for China, though she elaborates mostly on the figure of Tai Jitao. My study follows the argument and contends that Lin's connection to Yuanying here reflect this increasing willingness from Buddhist patriots within the KMT to tie themselves more closely to Buddhist nation-saving efforts. Taixu's mission then also needs to be situated within this shift in the KMT's attitude toward Chinese Buddhism. Widely known as one of the four eminent monks of the Republican era, Taixu was an influential leader who pushed for Buddhist modernization and reform. Like Yuanying, he was part of the South China Sea Buddhism, but also tried to expand his networks outside of maritime Southeast Asia. In particular, he had sent many of his disciples to countries in South Asia and mainland Southeast Asia to study Theravada Buddhist traditions. So what had been the impetus for Taixu's mission abroad? As covered just now, one important factor was the perception that Japanese propaganda claiming the destruction of Buddhism in China was making inroads abroad. In February 1939, Venerable Wei Fang, Taixu's disciple who also later accompanied him on the mission, published an article arguing for anti-Japanese diplomacy through Buddhism. Wei Fang stated that there was a pressing need to counter propaganda in South and Southeast Asia, that China was no longer a Buddhist majority country. He underscored anti-Chinese protests in Burma and the strategic significance of the area around Annam to China, where there were vital supply lines. It was an idea supported by KMT officials, such as Chiang Kai-shek himself. So on 21st July 1939, the Ministry of Social Affairs submitted a draft proposal for a Buddhist delegation to the Central Executive Committee. The proposal expressed that the main goal was to disseminate anti-Japanese war propaganda to the Buddhist lands of Burma, Siam, Annam, India, and Ceylon, and listed a string of requirements for the delegation's members. In November 1939, a delegation comprising Taixu and his disciples departed China. In countries like Burma, India, and Ceylon, Taixu and his delegation were received warmly. He met with many political and religious leaders whom he sought to gather international support for war-stricken China. On 17 March 1940, the day of his arrival in Singapore, Taixu addressed reporters where he summed up the purposes and achievements of the mission. He shared that the delegation had successfully raised awareness of China's wartime predicament in Burma, discussed cultural issues and Buddhism in India, and cultivated Buddhist links in Ceylon. As laid on in this address, he had not seen his mission solely in terms of spreading anti-Japanese propaganda. He also wanted to spread his vision for a global ecumenical Buddhist movement. Nevertheless, his endeavors in this regard drew criticism. I suggest that we interpret the article quoted at the start of this presentation as a reflection of disagreement that surfaced when Taixu's overseas audience failed to see his ecumenical ideas as being of benefit to the nation. So if we situate it within the modernist discourse that religion was to serve society and nation that gained strength under the nationalist regime, it is very likely that the overseas Chinese had kept an eye on developments back home and had engaged with these discourses concerning religion's relevance to the nation. To conclude, in response to funding constraints in China, Japanese propaganda concerning the state of Buddhism, and the need to secure international support in countries with substantial Buddhist populations, the Chinese Buddhists and KMT had worked in concert to organize these overseas missions. An additional food for thought would be that in using sources produced in Southeast Asia as a lens into the wartime circumstances of Republican China, it is an underlying contention of my study that the war experiences of Chinese communities in Republican China and in Southeast Asia were intimately linked. Moving forward, perhaps this can be a line of inquiry that can be taken up in further detail. Finally, I'd like to highlight some library resources that helped me greatly. So the library's access to archival documents was really helpful. Besides the archives of the nationalist period that I was able to access through the library, I want to point out that access to British archival documents also helped me in my research. So to gain insight to the movements of the Buddhist missions in countries like India and Burma, I depended not only on Buddhist hagiographical records and the delegation's own reports to KMT, but also British intelligence records in Burma and India. Next, I also realized that the library has extensive access to Buddhist periodicals. I cited journals like The Sun of the Sea Tide, and I was pleasantly surprised to find that we can find an entire digital collection through the library. Lastly, the resources available in the Chinese Southeast Asian collection has been invaluable. I have not relied solely on the National Library Board's digital collection for local newspaper articles. I actually found material on Chinese Buddhism in Southeast Asia. So for anyone interested, I highly recommend checking out the record of Chinese Buddhist missionaries to the South, a 3-volume publication on Chinese Buddhists in Singapore and Malaysia. For me, it served as a really useful source book containing many articles reporting on these overseas Buddhist missions from newspapers that I wasn't able to find through NLB. So with that, I've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Xiangyun. Last but not least, our final panelist is Tan Guanfan. Guanfan is an honors year history major with 2 minors in both art history and Southeast Asian studies. Passionate about diaspora, religions, art history, and material culture, he is a practicing artist and researcher who draws cultural inspirations from his Taixu heritage and subsequently from gathering new experiences and insights. Last year, Guanfan received the Distinguished Scholar Award from the Nian Gongxi and published his article on Yuhaiqing Temple in Burita to raise greater awareness about its art forms. He recently completed his honors thesis on Chuk Mor's Buddhist art and will begin his master's in history at NUS this fall. The floor is yours, Guanfan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chow, for the warm introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tan Guanfan. I'm a history honors undergraduate and very happy to be part of this panel discussion and to meet everyone here. Thank you for taking your time today. So my presentation title is Across Seas, Straits and Soils, Venerable Chuk Mor's Artworks in the Chinese Diaspora. This is also my honors thesis title. And across the seas, straits and soils, I'm referring to the South Seas or Nanyang, and then the straits of Malaysia and Singapore, and then the soils of mainland China, the Chinese periphery of Macau and Hong Kong, and maritime Southeast Asia. And then for artworks wise, I'm actually specifically looking at the Chinese paintings. But as we all know, Chinese paintings do have colophons, which include poems as well. So in those cases, I will also analyze them. And for Chinese diaspora, I'm looking at Chinese communities that are residing in Penang and Singapore. So this would be my presentation outline. Briefly, I will be looking at Venerable Chuk Mor's monastic career and legacy, but this would be a very brief one because my honors thesis actually aspires to recover his artistry that goes hand in hand with his monasticism. So my honors thesis primarily goes in two main trajectories. First of which would be the art creation, where I propose that he reinscribe Lingnan School's cosmopolitan art development in the Chinese periphery and the Nanyang. And second of which would be the diasporic Chinese reinterpretations of his paintings as it transferred through the different hands, and in such cases actually accrue different values and different meanings. So the last of which would be also sharing more about the library resources that I have used for this research. And so for this thesis itself, I have looked at a broad range of sources, including physical painting collections, painting albums like this one, which you can actually read later, 专项式书画集, and then also newspapers, 15 oral history interviews, and also national NUS Libraries resources, which yes, I will cover in a bit. So briefly on Chuk Mor Fa Shi, he is born in 1913 in Zhejiang, China, and then afterwards he traveled around the Chinese periphery of Penang, Hong Kong and Macau, and then afterwards migrated to Penang and Singapore. So from in the early 1950s, he made his journey from the Chinese periphery to Singapore and Malaya in general, and actually spent the next 50 years, roughly 50 years, until his death in 2002. So in this picture, another notable figure that we also notice is Venerable Xingyun, who has recently passed on, and Venerable Xingyun himself is actually 14 years younger than Chuk Mor, and Venerable Xingyun himself actually regards Chuk Mor as a very important figure for him as well. And in 1998, in the third photo, we have Chuk Mor actually being conferred the title of Datuk as recommended by his prominent lay disciple, Tan Sri Prof. Kozukun. And in the last photo, we have him celebrating one of possibly his last birthdays with two prominent lay disciples, one of which would be Prof. Kozukun, and the other would be Datuk Dr. Teng Hock Nan, which I'm very happy that I was able to interview both of them for my honors thesis. So two notable Buddhist sites that I have actually gone, and they actually hold very important, genuine and replica paintings and calligraphies, would be the Buddhist Triple Wisdom Hall in Penang, and the other would be in Singapore, Fu Yuan Lin or Fu Yuan Lim. So these two sites are very important because they are the nexus of how the Buddhist communities actually congregate and share about their ideas of Chinese Buddhism. So looking further into his artistry, my honors thesis first chapter actually looks at how he received the tutelage of Gao Jianfu, who is actually one of the three very prominent Lingnan school artists. And this master-disciple relationship started in 1941 when Gao Jianfu actually met Chuk Mor in Macau. And over the course of their tutelage, Chuk Mor actually imbibed many of the Chinese artistic techniques in the Lingnan school style, which I will go further into later. And we will note at how he actually reinscribes Lingnan school style along his own career and also along the career of Zheng Haoqian, who is actually his artist disciple, now based in Kuala Lumpur. But they met at Triple Wisdom Hall in Penang. So Zheng Haoqian himself is currently one of the few known art disciples of Chuk Mor and is a very established modern Chinese artist, having received Lingnan school training under Chuk Mor, and then later under Chao Shaoang or Chao Shaoan. So here we have a diagram of how I proposed my reinscription of Lingnan school art development, where it starts first from Gao Jianfu, and then how he started from Guangdong, and then he went to Japan in Kyoto, and subsequently they met, Chuk Mor and Gao Jianfu met in Macau. And so this is roughly how the journey went. And I primarily looked at Gao Jianfu and Chuk Mor's master-disciple relations. So briefly, a look into how traditional Chinese painting is actually being passed on. Usually there are two key processes. One is the copying and one is the referencing. So copying is lin mo, and then referencing will be mo jie. So some people actually combine both words and they use the word mo jie, lin mo and jie jian, jie jian. And so some of them, they will combine and use call this term as mo jie. And as you can see from the left painting, this is the one by Gao Jianfu, and then the right one is actually by Chuk Mor. We note quite a strong similarities, although there are also artistic inputs from Chuk Mor himself. And for Gao Jianfu himself, he also undergone the tutelage of Zhu Lian, who is another very prominent Chinese painter. And through their tutelage, they actually he actually learned zhuangfen, which is the sprinkling of powder, white powder with water, and then zhuangshui, which is the interaction between water and pigments. And together they help to create artworks that have this quality of fen cai mo gu, which essentially roughly translates to vivid colors, pastel-like colors, and a lack of outlines. So not forgetting the fact that Lingnan school itself is actually very cosmopolitan. So earlier on, we mentioned about the Chinese lineage or the Chinese connection. And here we also have a brief overview of the Japanese connection. Mainly two different schools, first of which would be the Chizhou school, and then the next of which I will cover soon, will be the Kano school. So Chizhou school, here we have three paintings, the left of which is Yamamoto Shunkyo, a Japanese artist, and he was a very pivotal influence for Gao Jianfu. So you can see clearly there is very close resemblance. And then afterwards, Chuk Mor himself, having been a disciple of Gao Jianfu, also mo jie this particular painting into his own, adding his own flavor to it, artistic inputs to it. So Chizhou school is mostly characterized by light brushstrokes, ink washes to create atmospheric effects, and therefore this is clear inflection of Western painting techniques, and then also the use of white spaces and poetic moods that is imbued into paintings. Kano school itself takes on a little bit of a more forceful, more energetic tone. So in this case, we have a lot more thick, terse brushstrokes, bolder, angular line work, and also sometimes piercing, dignified poses of their birds. So in this case, we can see most evidently in the middle painting by Gao Qifeng, the left of which is Gao Jianfu, and then the right of which would be Chuk Mor. So you would notice that the thick, terse brushstrokes can be very evident in the bifurcation of the tree branches, and also in the darker brushstrokes of the pine tree. So this is where I think the monasticism of Chuk Mor's, his own background actually bleeds into his artistry. Here we have, and as you would notice from most of his figurative drawings, there is a huge inclusion of Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, devotees, and also monks in general. and I focus mostly on Avalokitesvara or Guan Shiyin. And in this case, we notice how he actually experiments with different poses of Guan Shiyin, and also includes, it actually gives you a glimpse into the states of mind of Guan Shiyin herself. And then there is an incorporation of Buddhist symbols of lotus, which symbolizes different states of enlightenment. Next up, there is also a clear evidence that Chuk Mor himself was not working in a silo. He was very much immersed in the Nanyang scenery as well. In the left two paintings, we note that he was painting the indigenes and their livelihoods, and also capturing the flora and fauna. On the rightmost painting, we have entitled Kingfisher and Banana Tree by NUS Museum. So this is in our own university museum collection. And then throughout my research itself, I noticed that actually this painting was donated in 1972 by Chuk Mor himself, when Li Kongqian collection was actually coming into being. Then the next chapter that I looked at was the reinterpretation of Chuk Mor's paintings with manifold values. I primarily ground it based on these two theories, The Social Life of Things by Arjun Appadurai and Igor Kopytov. Essentially, it looks at how objects, when they transfer between different hands, actually reflect the social relations and the contextual significance. And therefore, objects are culturally redefined, and there are values that are imbued into the paintings beyond the initial stage of the artist, or in this case, Chuk Mor's artistic expression. So when Adamek and David Palmer actually pushes this theory a little bit further, contextualizes it in Chinese Buddhist culture through the idea of the Mahayana Buddhist soteriological notion of merit transfers. So essentially what this means is merit transfer is the process of exchanging this worldly altruism for otherworldly rewards of merit or gongde, yes. And this is secured and then compounded when these paintings are actually repurposed into for other functions or when they are reinterpreted by other groups of Chinese. So in this case, we note that in dialogue with the earlier scholarship by Marcel Mauss and his The Gift, we clearly see how paintings, when they are being transferred, are not actually free and disinterested process, but rather it is actually invested in a certain form of reciprocity. But this reciprocity itself is not expected from the receiver, but rather it comes in the form of hoping to obtain it through the god, or through, in principle, by the accumulation of karma. So in this case, I looked at the first example of gifting art. So earlier on, I mentioned about Tan Sri Prof. Kozukun, and so he shared about his own collection, and I want to pay attention to the middle fan painting, where Chuk Mor's gift itself actually helped to inspire his own Buddhist practice, and also helped to spur him to contribute back to society. In which case, there is a line that there are two verses that mention 客于不忘密真谛，自有光明照大天, which essentially more or less translates to how Chuk Mor hopes that the young Kozukun would continue to spend more time practicing Dharma, and then use that Buddhist wisdom to illuminate the mortal world. And true enough, this aspiration actually come to fruition, because young Prof. Kozukun actually later became the current advisor of the Young Buddhist Association of Malaysia. In the interest of time, I will move past this example. And so the other example of how his paintings were repurposed would be the exhibiting quality, or the display of artworks. So if we look at the right two photograph, this one with Zheng Haoqian and the newspaper snippet, we note how actually exhibitions itself gather Chinese diasporic communities to share more about Chinese Buddhist arts. And in this case, actually, there is a circulation of ideas more alongside the circulation of paintings when these paintings are actually sold. And the sales proceeds themselves then get transferred or in different forms. So such as the creation of scholarship, or in this case, the donation to Nanyang University, and then also publication of further Buddhist periodicals like his Wu Jin Deng or Inexhaustible Lamp. All right, and so last part would be the Chinese Buddhist arts and NUS library resources. I have looked at the digital gems, which has a really nice collection of Chinese language newspaper archives across the Southeast Asian countries, but I mainly looked at the Malaysia and Singapore ones, and also published materials such as, once again, the Chuanjiang Shihua Ji, which has a really nice collection of paintings and the other kind of Chinese arts, like his calligraphies and his seal carvings. And also Wei Mo Jing Jiang Hua, which is a book that I think would be quite important because Chuk Mor himself is very much inspired by Wei Mo or Vimarala Kurta. And Wei Mo, when he was giving his Wei Mo Jing lecture, was also the start when Gao Jianfu actually dropped in to listen to him lecture, and afterwards proposed to have this master disciple artist Buddhist kind of relations, or this kind of arrangement itself in Macau. And another book would be the Kong Hiap Memorial Museum, which is actually one of the very rare or few museums that has a wonderful collection of Chinese paintings that I think very few individuals are, very few people are actually going with, but it has a very good collection, including 4 of Chuk Mor's paintings. And lastly, we have the Xiyou Shi Cao, which is a compilation of 49 poems, where after Chuk Mor came back from Nepal, and it could be a very nice complementary source material to look at how the cross-disciplinary analysis between literature and visual arts. So that could be another line of inquiry to get a more fuller, more wholesome idea of his art making. And lastly would be, of course, Dr. Jack Chia's Monks in Motion, which I think, because one of his chapter looked at Chuk Mor, and it was a very important chapter where I was able to actually sort of trace Chuk Mor's artistry against his monastic career itself. And with that, thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Waiting for my colleagues. Yes.
Is it possible to off the projector?
Yes.
I can also look at the questions from Zoom later on. I think it's okay. Maybe I will sit here. I will sit here, so later I can stand. Let's come forward.
This is done.
Right, thanks. I won't drop this. Yeah, all right. Yeah, I can put this on my. Oh, yeah, thanks. This is iPad. Make sure I don't drop the laptop. No, I might drop my laptop drop moment. All right, we have about 30 minutes for Q&A. So I will now open the floor for questions from our in-person audience, but also our audience who are watching this this event online. So hello everyone. Yes, so for our online audience, please you are invited to post your questions in the Dropbox. And and when you ask a question, please identify yourself and please keep your question brief, right? So no mini lecture, please. All right, so I will now open the floor. Any questions from our audience? Anyone?
Questions?
Any question from our audience? Or maybe I can. How about our? Yes. All right.
Oh.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you were a music artist. So can I find out more about how this so you ended on the process of your study? Thank you.
You're asking whether how my art practice actually informs my understanding of Chuk Mor's art itself. So I must admit that I am not a Chinese painter. I practice more with Western art, but this is actually in fact my own personal little goal to understand more about Chinese painting, and therefore I sort of embarked on this little project. But anyways, I think because I have had experience with watercolor, I think that was actually something that helped me understand what zhuangshui and zhuangfen actually was, because they primarily operate on a similar kind of interaction between pigment and water, or even sometimes because if you are experimentative with your watercolor itself, you can also add other kind of impurities or other kind of materials that will help to enhance or give a bit of a different texture to your watercolor painting. So I thought that was quite an artistic parallel in a sense between the zhuangfen and zhuangshui together with my own watercolor practice. Thank you.
And we have a couple of questions from our online audience. So maybe I will let our online audience ask their questions first, and then we will go back to our in-person audience. So we have a question from Thomas Lee. Thomas has a question to our first speaker, Yuxuan. Thanks for the interesting sharing on your research. It is fascinating to see that imperial prefaces exert a political stand of the reigning monarch on Buddhism as a supporter or patron of the Buddha Dharma. However, how did the imperial preface as well as crown prince appendum portray the image of the Tang ruler, i.e. Taixu emperor, as a Buddha-like savior? It seems that the writing at most suggests depicting the emperor as a Chakravartin or universal monarch or Buddhist or Indic ideal. Are there other abstracts which shed light on the notion of Buddha-like savior within the imperial preface?
Thank you for the online audience for asking this very interesting question. Has actually been posed to me before, asking whether if there's any other instances in the preface itself. Yes, there are other instances that I do not have time to actually explain, but it doesn't only focus on the savior-like quality of the imperial preface, but also within these three imperial preface, as well discussed before, it also had this underneath this a correct way of interpreting the Dharma, and it is being supported by other primary sources that also talks about that the Xuanzang's way of translation, or Xuanzang's new translation, actually was tried to be pushed by the emperor for the only version, which is afterwards received a lot of backlash by their own monastery. And the savior-like quality is intertwined with this push for a correct orthodox, I would say, an orthodox way of Dharma itself. It repeats at least a few times within the other contents within a preface, but most importantly, it is being supported by Taizong's own policy, like his actual policy on the ground, where he hosted puja, when he actually tried his best to portray himself as someone who gained all the merits for his dead soldiers, his campaigns. I will not explain very detailed in here, but it's more of like his own real life action reflects the way that what he wrote inside the imperial preface, which both of it kind of collaborate on each other, that he is trying to sort of like show his savior-like quality and intertwine with the way of he's trying to push for orthodox Dharma. I hope that this actually answers your question. So it's more like other different sources that I will not talk about, but I would recommend for you to take a look at the Tang Da Zhao Ling Ji, which is one of the edits that he actually pushes for these specific ideas. Also, of course, like the Tang Taizong's and Tang Gaozong's Quan Tang Wen, where they actually wrote a number of things that is not collected as part of his edits as well. Yeah.
And Yixuan, you are very popular. Another question for you from our online audience, Alvin Wong. There was an Abhiseka of the Chakravartin written during the Tang Dynasty. Any records or sources to indicate that Emperor Taizong undergone this Buddhist coronation before being accepted as Chakravartin-like monarch? Thank you.
I am actually not very sure about the Abhiseka of Chakravartin. In fact, the main idea of what I'm trying to say in my research is that this Chakravartin, him Taizong writing saying that uses like this, we call it appellation, like he put it on his title saying that he's Zhuanbu or something along the line of Chakravartin. But here's the point, he puts it on title. What is his actual action to it? Anyone can put it on the title. He did that. It is a very common use of it. So my research is trying to show that he doesn't only simply uses this title on specific parts of his writing or other inscriptions. He actually tried to prove that he is this. I wouldn't say he proved that he's trying to be a Chakravartin, rather he tried to prove on other aspects to legitimize himself, which is why I always revolve around the idea of savior-like, because he's not trying to fit in that specific notion of Chakravartin. He didn't want to do that. It's just simply a title that has been placed on him. He's trying to fulfill other qualities. And for Abhisheka wise, as of my own knowledge, I do not know whether if there's any other ritual like ritual Abhiseka that has been done on Taizong himself, but as of my knowledge, I don't know. If there is, please tell me where can I find it in the sources itself. Yeah, I hope that actually somehow answers the question. If you need more explanation, please do write it inside the comment box.
Thank you, Yixuan. Any question from our live audience? Yeah. Will you identify yourself?
The second one.
Yeah.
So from my knowledge, so there are for most sacred sites in Buddhism in China, that Mount Jiuhua in Chengdu, Putuo in Chizhou, and Jiuhua in Anhui. So what criteria do you use to classify Jiuhua as the most sacred site in China?
I know you mentioned that the four famous Buddhist mountain in China, there's Mountain Wutai, Putuo, and Anhui and Jiuhua. But Jiuhua is very special because the other three mountains became the secret sites in the very early period. Especially, I mentioned that for the Anhui and Putuo and Wutai is in the middle period, but the golden period for the Mountain Jiuhua is the Qing dynasty. So my dissertation focuses on this dynasty, and I think that my research can be changing the pattern that existing pattern about the formation of a Buddhist secret site in China, because currently the scholars often pay more attention to the Wutai and the Anhui and the Putuo. So I hope I have answered your question.
We have specific criteria like any that how to say that the trademark from the government said that mountain that become the most sacred site in for Buddhist in China. Because for some country, like for in any other country, like we have for Buddhist, we have Lumbini in Nepal, Buddhist here. There are for sacred sites in the world, like in Nepal and in India. So they classify as the sacred site for Buddhist. And that just actually, I just asked that, is there any any trademark, any certification from the government to classify that Jiuhua as the most sacred site for Buddhists in China?
Oh, I see. Yes, you mentioned that the influence from India and the government forces. That is why I think I needed to research specifically in Mountain Jiuhua, because what you said is based on the history of Mountain Wutai, especially during the middle period and the Qing dynasty. But for the Mountain Jiuhua, the government forces in this region is not as strong as in Wutai Mountain. And I think the secure network is played a more important role in the formation of this secret site.
Thank you.
I remember I said, yeah. Could you identify yourself as a?
Disease outbreak in common politics, they are trajectories that people towards for example, say, religious. How would you think that this is actually towards modern day science?
The panelists can respond in the order of their presentation. So Yushen, I'd like to go first.
Okay, so this should be the hardest question for me because I'm doing something that's, I think, 1,400 years ago. Okay, so basically, this builds on to my proposed PhD research in the future, trying to look at there's this change in I'm trying to look at how the state versus the religion or the church in a certain sense, state versus the religion, how that relation change over time. This chapter, after the presentation, I'm only presenting one specific chapter out of my entire thesis. I'm trying to look at a sort of like a development, how this relationship changed within that dynasty itself through the use of just on imperial preface, of course supported by all other evidence. I don't want to argue just one single thing. But that itself, I hope to expand this entire research so that I could see there's this plausible transformation of this. You could call it as a discourse, could call it as the way of how they legitimize this, the state itself, how they use these Buddhistic terms, Buddhistic ideas to support their rule over such a huge region. And hopefully, in the sense of whether is there any influence of modern influence, perhaps hopefully might be able to influence modern perceptions of how like modern state, how do they employ specific Buddhistic terms to actually try to strengthen their rule or legitimize. The word is always revolving around legitimize their rule over the society or the government. Hopefully might contribute. So this is sort of like me doing a part of this whole historical development, just a very small part back in the past, and maybe could possibly give some idea for current modern exploitation. Yeah, for modern scholarship on modern Chinese or Buddhist / state relations.
Okay, my presentation, I wanted to say the academically, hopefully I have challenged the pattern I just mentioned before, that the scholarly always mentioned it had already concluded a pattern of the formation including the secret site, and but this pattern is concluded largely depends on the research on Mount Jiuhua and Anhui and there is lack of specific research on Mount Jiuhua. And secondly, I think that I hope those scholars who work on religious studies, especially the Buddhist studies, can pay more attention to so-called secular materials, not only focus on those religious materials that I showed on my cases, and also I cannot explain in my dissertation. There I find many local materials that are related to those holy sites. Those are not can be included as the religious materials, and those local peoples. I want to say that people is not only mentioned to the local lineages. In this case, I present today, but the monks inhabited on this mountain, and also the pilgrims, and also the people who provided the accommodations and service for those pilgrims. Those they are all contributed to formation a holy site. So hopefully those are my contributions.
I guess for my study, in my study, I suggested that prompted by the needs of war, the KMT drew this Chinese Buddhist into their diplomatic arsenal. So there was kind of like a change in their policy towards Chinese Buddhism. And this is a perspective that I don't touch on in my study, but I think Rebecca Neverstone suggests that the religious policy that kind of took shape throughout the nationalist regime was actually later adopted by the Chinese Communist Party. And so like if you look at the, I guess, the entire 20th century, you'll see later on that there's also this pattern of state-supported Buddhist diplomacy that even continues still today in the 21st century. So I was wondering if the war could possibly have been a turning point that had an influence in this kind of modern-day Buddhist diplomacy that we're seeing. Yeah.
As for my thesis, I think in general it's just to hope that it will raise more awareness for Chinese paintings, Chinese Buddhist paintings in Singapore, because we actually have a very rich collection of paintings. It's just that I guess many of us are deterred simply because, oh, it's Mandarin and might be difficult. But actually, I can attest that as long as you have a base understanding of visual arts, it's actually possible to slowly ease your way into understanding Chinese painting. As for literature, in terms of the scholarship-wise, I think my thesis contributes to three main parts: the Buddhist studies, the overseas Chinese, and the global art histories. So for Buddhist studies, there is a growing but still understudied aspect of Southeast Asian Buddhism, where we are looking at diasporic Chinese communities in this region, but there is still very little scholarship into their art production. And as for overseas Chinese, many of the histories on overseas Chinese, there tends to be also written in Chinese or Mandarin media. So that in itself also deters individuals who are more proficient in English but are not able to read, and therefore they cannot actually appreciate Chinese paintings at a deeper level. So in terms of my thesis, it being in English language hopefully would encourage more people to read and understand more about Lingnan school painting and Chuk Mor's art production. As for lastly, global art history, this has been a discipline that has been growing since the 1980s. And it's really looking at how art objects actually do not have a firm origin point, do not have and have many intertwining trajectories, and they also do not have very conclusive endings. So in my case of Chuk Mor's paintings, we note that how he actually amalgamates different cultural inspirations through Gao Jianfu, but also in his own Nanyang experience and through his own monastic career. So I think global art history in this case, my thesis hopes to contribute into the idea that not just looking at his art creation, but his art circulation and how there are multiple lives that are actually happening to these paintings when they change from different hands, sometimes to collectors, sometimes to when they are being displayed on the walls and enjoyed by the crowds. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Any questions from our live audience? All right, if not, we have a question from our online audience. Thomas Lee has a question for Guan Fan. The reading of merit making as an exchange for good vibhaka or karmic reward in a reciprocal way sounds contradictory to the Mahayana Bodhisattva ideal, which is altruistic. May I understand in which context does this merit transfer be regarded as Mahayana?
I would say that in terms of the specifics, I might not be extremely, I might not have the most expert knowledge in this domain, but I was referencing Wendy Adamek and David Palmer, who are both very prominent scholars in Chinese Buddhism. So although their article is actually looking at gift exchanges among Buddhist communities in China, my thesis actually extends that to diasporic Chinese communities and looking at how, because Adamek and Palmer looks at Mahayana Buddhist soteriological merit transfer as a concept that is the basis of the gift exchange. Therefore, I'm using that framework to analyze Chuk Mor's paintings and how they go through different contexts and therefore accrue different values. I hope that answers your question.
Any more questions? Yeah.
I'm Zhang from Humanities and Sciences. My question is for how did you arrive at this body of paintings by Chuk Mor? And you mentioned about your sources, which are the catalogs and the museum collection, but it seems like you have access to some in the private collections. Are you able to speak more about the imagery in the collections?
Thank you, Zhang Jie. Your question is looking at my methodology and how I gather my sources, right? The visuals. Okay, so I think I first started out with this book. I know this this was the starting point at which me to this book. So I must say that my first understanding of Chuk Mor actually started during Dr. Chan's book. His chapter on Chuk Mor was actually my preliminary understanding of this migrant monk. And of course, with the help of Dr. Chia and also a few other serendipitous moments when I actually went on artist talks and realized that, oh, actually, this artist is actually connected to Chuk Mor. And also, with the help of Dr. Huang, who connected me with another interviewee, I was able to actually arrange a research trip to go to Penang and KL, where I was able to visit the Triple Wisdom Hall, where it has a really rich collection of Chuk Mor's paintings, and also to arrange interviews with Prof. Kozukun and a few other interviewees like Zheng Haoqian. So they were able to, in preparation for my interview, they were able to gather a few of their art pieces so that I was able to interact with them physically. So very warm thanks to Prof. Kozukun and Dr. Tang, Dr. Tani, and also Prof. Zheng Haoqian, who were very helpful during the trip. But in terms of physical collections itself, I think a lot of it is actually through hearsay as well. Not hearsay might not be the best way. One of my I'm very thankful that friends and my professors who were able to help me check out my interviewees as well, whether they know of any other places to find these artworks. And because some of them, they are friends with other collectors or they know of different museums, such as actually the Kongkyak Memorial Museum was through one of my interviewees' recommendation that I should really go since I'm doing Chinese painting. That is a must-see place. Yeah, so and apart from Chinese painting albums, I think the other important resource would be, say, going to like NUS Museum, which also has one of the physical paintings, but also other Lingnan School paintings, so that I was able to cross-reference and get a better sense of Lingnan School as a movement, and therefore how did Chuk Mor's painting actually fit and maybe even extend the concept of Lingnan School. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Time for a final question. Okay, we have a final comment from our online audience. Thomas Lee, to our last speaker, Guan Fan, thanks for the clarification. The term Mahayana is doctrinal, thus may not be accurate with regard to the said context. May I suggest the use of Chinese Buddhism instead, as it is cultural and geographical in nature? which is more relevant to the context mentioned. Just my 2 cents. All right. So, if there are no further questions, please join me in thanking our panelists for their wonderful presentation today. And thank you all for joining us. Thank you.
Ms. Gandhi to present topics of appreciation to our speakers of the region. Thank you all for being here and making today's event a successful one. Thank you.
Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, all the best for you. Thank you so much. Very English. You are linking KMK.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
The end of the seminar. Thank you to all our speakers, patients, and welcome, as well as our moderator, Cha, for the wonderful engaging seminar. I would like to thank all the participants for joining us this afternoon. We hope to see you again in our live events. Thank you.